Welcome to the Esports Business Podcast, where we connect the time-tested principles of business and team management with the rapidly growing esports industry. I'm Ben Wiggins, here with Shivneet Sharma. Thanks for checking in with us. Shivneet, what's good?
Oh, it's going good. It's a nice morning where I'm at.
Yes, it is. It's thunderstorms here, but I'm safe and warm indoors and looking forward to this conversation. It's going to be a good one today. But first, let's get into our main news story. We're all aware of the power of virtual reality in the entertainment field, but as this technology continues to rise, we will probably see it have many further uses in education, construction work, policing, you name it. This also includes medicine. A story from Gaming for Cash this week takes readers on a journey through virtual reality therapy, which is the use of VR technology for occupational or psychological therapy. Patients that receive virtual reality therapy navigate their way through digitally created environments, completing specially designed tasks along the way that are often tailored to treat a specific ailment. A company called Akili has some rather interesting goals in this matter. Akili is a Boston-based tech company that is using Neuroscape's core technology to develop a mobile game called Project EVO. The idea of this game is to treat PTSD in children. Gaming for Cash identified this as a prescription video game. This technology, just like anything used in medicine, has to go through trials and processes that are required by the FDA. It is not finished yet, and currently it is in phase 3 of clinical trials. However, if they do succeed, that will make Project EVO a first prescription-based video game in the US. This means that a completely new branch emerges, called basically digital medicine. The team at Neuroscape, whose technology Akili uses, has spent the last 12 years testing video game technology that could be used for the treatment of brain disorders such as ADHD, autism, depression, Alzheimer's, and more. Shivneet, what's up?
When we get into the space of video games and health benefits, I want to try to address one thing at a time. So I'll talk about health benefits first. I think there are definitely some health benefits in terms of like reaction time, but I'm under the conventional thinking that nothing can really replace working out, running, and just typical cardiovascular work, right? And I know me and you both come from backgrounds of, weightlifting and cardiovascular work, so I don't think there's any replacement for that. I do think that video game has its space in mental health. I think the way social circles are being developed now are different than it was 20 years ago, right? I mean, arcades were definitely a thing, but you had a very small community of people going to arcades and meeting the same people and putting a quarter down to beat them in Tekken 1 or Tekken 2 or Street Fighter 2.
You're taking me back, my friend.
Yeah, or playing Time Crisis with your buddy. I mean, that's just what it is. But I think now the way how accessible gaming is and how accessible online play is, you have people making Discord friends and Discord servers, people that have never actually seen each other physically, go halfway across the country to go to each other's people's weddings and things like that.
So this is really exciting. I am a big believer in the power of games and simulated training to do a variety of different things. Obviously, as you said, Shivneet, physical training, there's a certain degree to which you have to interact with the actual world. But in terms of training your mind, Thrive Global published a story that says games improve visual processing, attention and vigilance, executive function, and connectedness. Psychology Today has commented on the cognitive, creative, motivational, emotional, and social benefits of gaming as well. We see how important practice is to almost any discipline. I think finding ways to simulate situations that would be impossible to construct in real life has huge potential. The big thing I worry about is oversight. Yes, this game is being supervised closely because it's being used on a prescription basis, but what's to stop me making a game that assists Alzheimer's treatments and selling it over the counter? I do have some concern both for patients and manufacturers because legislators by and large are older people and their history with evaluating games in a reasonable way is spotty at best. It's going to take a long time for public understanding to catch up with a field like this.
I agree with the mental health benefits. The problem I see in the future, looking at it from a business standpoint, is big pharma. Where do people make money off of video game therapy, right? Where are we going to get the infrastructure to convince, like you said, legislators and just other companies, like, hey, this can be more lucrative than antidepressants. This can be more lucrative than oxycodone, hydrocodone. Just all these sort of medicines that make it's a billion-dollar industry, and I stress billions for a reason. The mental health aspects are definitely there, right? I mentioned social circles. I mentioned how video games can be therapeutic. Getting lost in a world is something I hope everybody gets to do in a video game. Something like Breath of the Wild, God of War, Killzone. I mean, even back to the early days of Half-Life and Half-Life 2, like that was crazy, right? Playing with the gravity gun. And I think video games are therapeutic. Are they able to alter brain chemistry to a point where somebody can, in theory, and I use the word cure lightly, cure depression, cure anxiety, cure stress? I think it's more just a temporary thing, and I think those sort of issues stem from my viewpoint. I think they stem from a very like personal and deep down kind of level, and I think video games can definitely ease the pain, but I think overall you need to be able to face those demons eventually.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And the possibility for misuse, just as we ran into with opiates and with a number of other drugs, is also present here. If a company stands to gain from something that is not necessarily in the best interest of the user, what's to stop them from doing it? And the idea of oversight in a process like this, again, it's just, I think there's a lot of nuance to it, and we really need to carefully consider how we monitor the way that companies are using things like this, even if their intention is just to help people. The idea that the process could backfire or that it could be misused is something that we need to take very, very seriously.
I want to get on the last point as well, the VR technology we mentioned earlier and how it can help doctors. So this is just my personal view. I don't think we're at a point where VR can effectively do anything well. I think VR is still in an infancy stages of, what things look like in VR, graphics. I think we may, I think augmented reality is also kind of in its infancy, and I think VR sort of needs to develop more just as its own program and as its own service, and it needs to essentially to step its game up before it can be implemented into real world application, right? Like training surgeons in VR, maybe, right? But maybe we should possibly look into teaching kids how to do sports in VR, or maybe physical therapy in VR. I think we're sort of jumping the gun.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned surgery, because there is one other facet to this story. Dr. Nadim Parker wants to advance the practice of surgery by making visualizations of organs and human bodies easier through VR. He started with 3D printing organs 2 years ago, and a gamer friend of his suggested that he move to virtual reality. Dr. Parker commented, "I thought if we can figure a way to convert organ images, especially in very complicated cases, it could help the surgeons. But 3D printing takes time. I had to find something that was quicker. When my friend asked what was next, I thought I have to do something in virtual or augmented reality, but I needed engineering help. So I went to the IT people at St. Louis University. He and his associate, SLU's Kyle Collins, didn't find anyone else using VR in this space." So I think this one really only has upside. I think it would be pretty easy to get approval for simulated training programs. The main thing is making sure the technology stays affordable. We see how the costs of things get driven up in the medical field. It would be pretty easy to take a program that took $50K to build and charge $500,000 for installation, which then drives up the already rising cost of surgeries. Competition in this field will be our friend as consumers of medical care.
I think, like I mentioned earlier, and the image that comes to mind when I think of VR and surgery is that one surgery game where you have the mouse and you have to perform surgery. I think it's Surgeon VR or something like that. It's such a funny game, and I don't mean to put VR and I don't mean to put down VR, but I mentioned that we just aren't at a point where we can implement VR to an effective level in at least the medical surgery area, right? I mentioned we can do it with physical therapy, right? Things like shoulder therapy, things like knee therapy, things like walking when you're in a different environment, right? I mean, I've done physical therapy before, and it's not fun, right? The space you're doing it in is just depressing. It's so bad, but it's meant for your health benefit, and you understand it. If I had a VR headset on and I was walking down the street and there was some crazy stuff going on, I would be more inclined to walk more, right? I just feel like the environment takes a real big toll on certain things, and I think VR can push the boundaries of social and mental benefits on things like therapy rather than trying to implement it into more technical aspects.
Our guest today is a former National Student Journalist of the Year and is the current Director of Content for our very own parent company, Top Score Solutions. MinorMishap, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So tell us a little bit about how you came to Top Score. I think one of the things we'd like to do on the show today is to give people a little bit of a glimpse into how the company actually works. But in the meantime, tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to us.
Sure. So I'm actually a trained journalist turned graphic designer turned content strategist. And I used to be a big gamer and actually kind of fell out of the scene, like I think happens to a lot of females during kind of your teenage years. But I was reintroduced by my boyfriend a couple years ago and just like really went in head first. Eventually, as happens to me very often in my career, I really wanted to kind of mix my professional work with the things I was interested in. So I immediately set out kind of, especially like right as the Overwatch League took off was whenever I really was like, okay, there's work for me here. So I went out trying to get all the content that I possibly could, heard an ad about Top Score on Omnic Lab, jumped into the server, and I kind of lurked for quite some time. And it wasn't until Jake actually posted that he was looking for help with graphic arts. And so, pretty much snowballed from there.
And this is Jake Baez,
yes,
who is a dear friend of the show and a dear friend of Top Score. So shout out to Jake. So then, obviously Jake is a great guy to work with, but how did you find your place? Like, what was your perception of how the company was functioning originally? And how do you think you found a home there? I feel like it seems like you have a fairly comfortable niche at this point, but Top Score is, a company that's, constantly finding its form, I think, in a way. So what did that process look like for you?
Well, as I said, whenever I first decided, because I work freelance, so I have lots of different clients in lots of different industries. So once I decided, okay, I really want to find something in this field, I noticed that it was very hard to get your foot in the door. Anything that I did find said must have prior esports experience. And so I found myself really having a harder time than I've had in any other industry, trying to make content for any other industry, I should say. The esports world and the gaming world in general, you really have to have that specialized knowledge. And I wasn't sure how to drum that up myself. And I kept hitting a wall every single time I found something that might be an opportunity. So that to me was what I found to be the most approachable about Top Score and the most exciting was that I was welcomed right off the bat and I didn't feel as though I needed to have something to prove a reason that I belonged there, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And that honestly, that is why Top Score exists. Like we can publish, esports business stuff. And we have a little bit of a competitive advantage in doing that for a variety of reasons. But really, it's about economizing on the fact that the business is just super tough to break into. And if we form kind of this collective thing, then we can get a lot of people the experience that they really want. And we get something out of it too.
I kind of want to go back into your background a bit. You said you were a trained journalist and then you became if I'm saying this, a graphic artist. Do those sort of fields cross over, or like was it something that came out as a journalist and then you realized you always did art when you were younger? Do those two kind of fields help each other in your work now as you do freelance?
Oh, absolutely. So when I first started, I went into it just looking at journalism as a whole. And I was very interested in art as a child. And, art was always a very natural thing for me. But the difference for me and what really opened everything up for me was journalism. Using that artistic talent came out fully when it came to organizing content and making it easy to understand. For me, yes, I like art. Yes, I have a visual talent, you could say, but where I really find passion is when there's something important that I know needs to be communicated. And so, yeah, the crossover there for me was just always there, and it really kept me going and kept me motivated throughout.
I wouldn't say I'm not insanely talented.
Well, no, definitely though, it has to do, with that important factor of the news and journalism and information. You can just put something in front of someone and they won't necessarily understand it. So it's that kind of magical ability to figure out what's important and what's going to make someone actually understand it.
So you mentioned how tough it is to get into the esports scene. I think everybody are in Top Score Solutions, or even when they leave and stuff, sort of mention that. When you were looking at jobs, were companies not interested in your journalistic background and your portfolio at the time? Was it not I'm looking at your portfolio now, and it's a lot. There's a lot of different kinds of work. It's super extensive. When you were getting to the esports scene in the Overwatch League, I think it was about a year ago. Was it sort of they just weren't looking? You didn't have what they were looking for, or was it just they really wanted the prior esports experience, regardless of how talented you were?
Well, to tell you the truth, I didn't even try. I really didn't see the industry as something that I could take on and be successful at. So I looked at the job postings and I really didn't even want to apply before getting that prior experience. When
was it when you sort of decided that, Top Score Solutions is the place that I want to build my portfolio, my esports portfolio? What did you just look for an opening? Was it sort of the company that attracted you? And what was in Top Score that kind of made you stay, I guess?
Yeah, in addition to really just looking to get those clips for my portfolio, I have a natural kind of tendency to not only want to organize content, but want to organize people creating content. So that was really my reason for getting in, yes, was because I wanted clips for a job, but the job that I actually really enjoy doing is organizing people, creating the content. So that's definitely why I stayed and why I, became so involved.
So how do you then balance your desire for your own creative output with your desire to the editorial drive in you with the internal creative drive in you?
So I think that that's definitely something that any editor or creative director has to deal with. It's a very interesting question because it's definitely a problem, but it's not something that comes to my attention very often because I find that my creative ability comes out through editing as well, even though it might not seem like that would be the case. Whenever I have a team that I'm working with, I don't need to necessarily be the one making the visual decisions, but if I'm working with them and editing with them, my creativity still ends up coming out.
I think that feeds into the work-life balance kind of, equilibrium, right? You don't want to you want to keep your work and your life hobbies separate. So from that, I want to ask, were you ever afraid that sort of your artistic side would seep into your work lifestyle and your hobby would kind of stop becoming your hobby and more your work? Or was that always something you were ready to take on when it came to combining both your journalistic side and your more artistic and design side?
Yeah, that was pretty much unavoidable for me. I definitely from the beginning have decided that was going to happen no matter what. So it's never been really a worry. It's definitely been something that I lean into.
Mishap, tell us about a recent project that you've done, maybe to help our listeners understand a little bit more about what you do both inside Top Score and also outside of Top Score.
So recently, I've been doing a lot of work with a socially responsible investment firm creating content for them that includes eco-friendly fabrics that you should buy if you want to be eco-friendly, fabrics that you shouldn't buy. Also, the same thing with food that is and isn't eco-friendly and how you can choose to spend your money, different banks that you should use or not use. All of those things are projects that I've been very involved in lately.
You were talking about social responsibility, and I think one of the things that big business is really paying attention to now is being aware of the externalities that it creates and taking a hand in things like social responsibility. What do you think? Where do you think that plays into esports? And I'll give an example that I was thinking of myself. In terms of being aware of player health and the amount of time that players are committing to the game, being aware of, hand issues or, eye issues or things like that can result from playing really, really long hours of esports games. That's one area that publishers and developers really have to, I think, be socially conscious. But where do you think are there any other areas, since you're familiar with the kind of social consciousness space, what do you think are the other things that we want to be aware of from a cultural standpoint as esports starts to take a bigger place in our society? Do you have thoughts on something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this kind of goes back to the question earlier about combining all of these things and work-life balance. I definitely see how the other work that I'm doing can relate to esports, especially when it comes to, all of the things that you just mentioned, but a lot of esports businesses are being run exactly the way Top Score is, remotely. And there's something to be said about that when it comes to planning your business, because you can really reduce your carbon footprint as a company by not only doing that, but doing it consciously and figuring out how you're going to manage your employees. So I think that that's something that there definitely is a big opportunity for that in the esports industry.
So how do you feel about all these sort of companies now relating to the NFL and NBA, building stadiums and doing all these sort of training facilities and stuff? Do you think that they should be, obviously they should be eco-responsible, but I want to kind of know your take on, like, do you think it's that's needed, or do you think the format we have now, where all the teams go into one stadium, is more socially conscious, eco-conscious? Like, I kind of want to know your thoughts about all that, the big infrastructure.
So while I haven't thought about that specific situation, I think that this is really where esports and the specialization that it requires to work in this industry has a chance to bring something to the rest of the world, something more than just, okay, these are gamers doing gamer things. I think that just the fact that the esports industry is in such a unique position, whether or not we should have those stadiums or we shouldn't, these questions are more important than just how do we want to watch this game.
So one of the biggest steps that Overwatch League took relative to like NALCS or something like that was specifically the idea of geolocating teams and building team brands around that regional loyalty. And by the way, it's worked. Even on somebody, like, I'm aware of the economics of that, and I still have a Houston Outlaws jersey in my closet. So then talking about how we balance the idea of reducing carbon footprint with the idea of really appealing to people's sense of like closeness with someone or some team who they feel like is in the room with them, and in some cases is literally in the room with them. And there's actually another question, which is, so for a company like Top Score that it's doing most of its business remotely, is there something that we lose in communicating like this as opposed to communicating face-to-face? And then how do we balance that against the carbon footprint thing and the social responsibility thing that you were talking about? Because all of those things are important. and how do we play them against each other and try to strike that balance?
I think that question in particular can also be applied to, like I discussed earlier, having remote employees. I think that those two things really go hand in hand. And I wish I had a perfect answer for how to tackle that. But I do think that those two problems are going to come up and they go hand in hand. So these are the things that our businesses are going to have to face and question and really discuss. And it goes back to the fact of the conversation about esports doesn't have to be all about gamers, especially because this industry is growing and it's becoming huge. It can really, really set an example for other industries.
That's a really good point. We may end up cutting this, but I do think so. Here are my additional thoughts. I think that you're right, and I think that unfortunately, in a rapidly growing industry, people take notice of this sort of thing basically when they have to. Like if there was some kind of tragedy that clearly, and hopefully we never get to that place, but if there's some kind of tragedy where player health and player mental health plays a major role in how things unfold, then developers and publishers will have to take note of that. If there's some sort of issue where I don't know how it would play into the carbon footprint thing, but I think basically the unfortunate truth is that a company like Blizzard and its parent company Activision is beholden to shareholders, and we are all a little bit hypocritical in that we want to take care of things, but if it affects our investments, if it affects our family's financial future, then all of a sudden we're much less willing to listen. And I think that thinking, long term about how do we address problems before they become emergencies, how do we address players' mental health and so forth, how do we address, the carbon footprint that results from something like Overwatch League. I think trying to be ahead of those questions is really important, but unfortunately, the force that pushes back on that is share price oftentimes, and that's. I wish there was something that could be done about that, but I'm not sure that there always is.
When we look at, like, I guess, the industrialization almost of esports, right, or like the evolution of esports, right? When we were, growing up, right, and not to carbon date any of us here, but we're a bit older than what the current esports viewing crowd is. I mean, when we saw esports, it was like grassroots. I mean, NALCS, back when I used to watch it in season, like the very first season, it was just like a small studio with like 50 people, not even 50 people. There's like some random teams. Now that we have all this investment, right, where there's like each Overwatch League spots are $20 million, LCS spots are 50 million, EU LCS or LEC is what they call it now. I mean, the big push to branding and everything. I think we might face a problem down the line where esports is growing too big too fast, and that event that you were talking about, the sort of tragedy that obviously we don't want it to happen, it'll be like a full team of players sort of collapsing in a sense of like financially. They actually don't have investors, they actually don't have the money, and these people got used and abused, right? That happens in esports every now and then, but it has to be like a really big company, right? And I think when we look at getting back into the eco footprint and stuff, I think the geographical like fan sort of, or fan building doesn't really work in esports because players aren't long lasting, right? There's no legacy players in a lot of esports teams. I mean, you look at LCS, yeah, maybe Bjergsen for TSM, Doublelift used to be for CLG, Afromu used to be, but these guys are just kind of going towards the best teams, and more teams are going the sort of Golden State Warriors route, where it's more important about winning rather than building a fan base, where you're at. And I think that's just a problem of what esports is, right? There's no legacy players. There's no salary caps. There's no cap limits. There's no 5-year contract. I think it's just really, really kind of, it's still wild, wild west.
Yeah, I do think people are perfectly willing to root for laundry, just like they do in soccer.
I was just going to say, I think that a lot of what we're discussing now can be addressed by the still budding local esports industry. I think that right now everyone has their eye on esports as a worldwide thing, which it is, which is one of the most amazing things about it. But I think that, we can address these issues from a local perspective. And that's another, aspect of the work that I do that I'm very passionate about, is pushing local communities, really trying to pivot and think about how we can think about things in a more local focused mindset. So, when we talk about the issues between connecting people with fans, between connecting employees and employers, I think that there's a local aspect to that we might have to get creative with in the long run.
I kind of want to segue back into your role in esports and how you feel about esports. Where, what are you looking to achieve, I guess, out of TSS and like in the esports industry in general? Does your dream job lie there, or does your dream job sort of align with freelance esports stuff, kind of like how Shocks does with Riot and how Ovally does with Riot? I believe they're both freelance. They're not necessarily employed by Riot, but they do a lot of the hosting and stuff like that. Do you kind of want to do not the hosting aspect, but the more graphic artists and do be featured on some of their art stuff? Where does MinorMishap fall into esports as a whole?
I think if I had to say, my dream job would be doing the more freelance work for bigger organizations, but I would like it to be rooted in a local co-working space where there's other people that do the same thing that I do, freelance for esports organizations, but we all go somewhere in person and work, if that makes sense. Like an esports only co-working space where I can do my freelance work, but I'm not doing it from a computer away from everyone else who's interested in it.
So then, do you think we could find, I'm just kind of spitballing here, but could a company like Regis that offers office space in local areas, and you can basically they do short-term leases in office buildings, would a company like that makes things available, that makes smaller spaces available for shorter times, is that kind of the missing, could that be the missing link? Or is this something that would have to be industry specific, or at least specific to a smaller set of industries? Or is it something where we need an esports specific solution? Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that it is esports specific.
Oh, okay.
And this is kind of, what I was saying earlier with my other work that I do is different from the work I do in esports, and why I didn't apply. All of that comes back to the fact that this industry is different and the audience is different. You really need to have that passion. And this is true for lots of different industries, but in esports and in gaming, people really don't know what you're talking about at all if they don't know. So I think that community aspect that I feel is missing for the fans and for the employees, I think that there needs to be an esports specific place where companies can go and aspiring, workers can go, where they can meet in the middle and kind of, already that the people here know what you're talking about.
That makes sense. So the obvious challenge for something like that would be being able to scale it and, making something like that viable in order to, if you don't have enough esports people to be able to pay the bills for something like that, are there any other industries that are really close to esports that you feel like could help bridge that gap? Like, for example, film and television. If people wanted to have like a very small film or television studio, or even like just something for like an ad studio, like that sort of thing. If it's creative enough, do you think there's potential for crossover there, or what? And if the answer is no, then what is it that is so magical about specifically and exactly and only esports?
I think that there could be crossover. I have a lot of experience working with content marketing firms that produce content for many, many different industries. However, I don't necessarily think right now those places are a good fit for esports because they don't have a specialized reporter who is focused on that. The biggest comparison that I could make probably would be within regular sports. I mean, you wouldn't have someone who doesn't know anything about sports handle any aspect of your business that is related to sports. You just wouldn't. So I think, and I mean, it's not a direct comparison because we're talking about a lot of people and more than just a reporter. But I do think that, yes, existing firms, existing businesses can create within themselves specialized esports segments. And that's what we see with a lot of the big esports news outlets. They're owned by very big media companies. So obviously people are already doing that, but I don't think it's necessarily accessible to people just getting out of college now or people who are in high school. I think that it's all happening so fast that there are so many people interested and there's really not an organized place for them to go. So yes, I do think over time businesses can learn to, make themselves have a specialized branch that has to do with esports. I just think that's going to take a long time.
Are you saying businesses like standard businesses like Lockheed and Martin, NASA, or are you saying businesses that sort of belong in the space, right? That deserve to, things like, Coke or GameStop, recently GameStop, or I don't know if any business throwback, Jinx Gaming and Clothing, if anybody knows what that is. Do you think the sort of businesses that deserve is maybe not the right word to use, but sort of mesh with esports on a holistic level, kind of need to have eventually an esports division, or is it just, hey, if you're interested, kind of just make one and treat your esports division correctly?
I think that it would be any company that wants esports related content. So whether that is, the difference would come if they're a business that has their own internal content team or if they hire an external content team. So I think a lot of those that you mentioned probably have their own internal content team. So they would need an esports division within that. Or if you're a company that hires an external content team, you need to hire an external content team that has an esports division.
Okay, so we've talked both today and at other times about the difficulty of getting into the esports industry. And obviously, I mean, Top Score Solutions is trying to take some steps to address that. But just broadly speaking, for someone coming out of college or even someone coming out of high school who's still making decisions about what they're going to do in college, what advice would you offer them if they have a strong interest in esports and also design, journalism? You've worn a lot of different hats, and a lot of them are in industries that are high visibility that a lot of people want to get into. What would you say to someone who is interested in those things?
The first thing I would say to someone interested in those things is that you don't need to move to a bustling city to get started. Specifically freelancing, if you're interested in getting a job at a specific company, that's a completely different story. But if you're interested in freelancing, if you're interested in, specifically freelancing in esports, I would say the best piece of advice I can give you is try to live with as little rent as you possibly can. live at your parents' house for a few months if you have to. You just need to get one client, and then you can work from referrals. And I've found that it's very difficult to do that when you're having to work a part-time job or multiple part-time jobs while trying to freelance. It just gets away from you. So if you can just take a break, if you at all have the means to, just take a break and try to get that one client to get yourself started.
So Kelsey, we've talked quite a bit about your life. We've talked quite a bit about esports, but if people want to know more about your freelance work, they want to contact you, maybe we got some listeners that'll hire you. Where can they find everything and anything? Your Twitter, your YouTube, your LinkedIn, your everything.
I am not very active on social media. I do have a website. It's kelseybell.myportfolio.com, and you can contact me through that website. I do have a Twitter. I don't think I've tweeted in 4 years, but it's kbell with a 3 for an L, and I'll take you as a follower if you want. You can also find our weekly segment, in case you missed it, at Esports Business News on Instagram. One word. Check it out every week.
All right, Mishap, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us about it. It ended up being a little bit more of a discussion and a little bit less of an interview, which I think is great. We talked some about social responsibility. We talked some about breaking into the esports business and localization, globalization. Fascinating stuff. Thank you. Thanks everyone for listening. Make sure to check back every week for more episodes. Our newest segment with the company, in case you missed it, can be found on Instagram at Esports Business News. If you have a moment to subscribe to the pod on iTunes and leave us a 5-star review or offer us some feedback, we greatly appreciate it. We love positivity, but also we want to make the show the best it can be. If you want to do more to support us, consider joining our Patreon under Top Score Solutions and get access to exclusive content and perks. We've also put links to our Discord, Twitter, Facebook, and website in a shortened link in the show post. We appreciate you listening. Stay gold, everyone.